Hello everyone and good evening. We'll start po in about 2 minutes. So, see you in a bit. All right, so good evening everyone. It's now 7:30 and let's now start with our class for tonight. And hope everyone's doing fine and hope everyone's still excited with our new lesson for tonight. All right, so yep, let me share my screen. So let me know if you can see my screen. So kindly give a thumbs up. You can see my screen. Hello. Can you guys hear me or? Oh, okay. Right. So I will be showing our new lesson for tonight. Let me just move this a bit. All right. So again, good evening, everyone. So for tonight, we will be talking about lesson 5 of our course about HTML and CSS, and it's under the module 3. So last time we've talked about styling and formatting text, as well as including font files and how to implement styles for the fonts and text. So now we are now going to talk about the block model. All right. So if you remember last time I told you about doing an advanced lesson or learn your lesson in advance regarding block model, since this lesson will contain more of a concept. Like I will teach you, we will focus more on the concept side of CSS and how does block model work. So please bear with me in the next 2 hours. So hopefully everyone can follow. So yeah, but before we proceed with our lesson for tonight, so this will be our session format for uh, this lesson. So first, we will be going over the remaining questions about the previous lesson, and then we will also be doing a homework walkthrough. So we now have two homeworks uh, since the beginning. So for those For those of you who are still struggling with the homeworks, so we will be tackling some of the issues that you're having later on. So we'll spend like around 30 to 40 minutes for the homeworks. So, and then after that, we will be going over the current lesson. And of course, question and answers after that. All right, so first, looks like we don't have any other remaining questions from the previous lesson other than this one. So for the homework number 2, another, will it be another markup? So we will be talking about that in a bit in a different uh, repository. All right. Okay, so let's now go to our homework walkthrough. All right, so you now have two homeworks. Okay, so homework number 1, it generally covers just the markup, the HTML markup. All right. Then for the homework 2, uh, this covers CSS. So you should be styling CSS or applying CSS styles in homework number 2, but this will only cover up to the text and styles. So the last lesson that we have. So that's the only coverage of homework number 2. And then for this new lesson, this will be part of homework number 3. All right, so let's go back to the homework 1 and let's see. So let's look at the criteria for homework number 1. Again, so for homework number 1, which covers module number 1, this mostly covers only the markup. All right, so if we look at the design for your homework, so you don't necessarily need to implement all of this, including the styles and the layout for homework number 1. All right, so just to be clear with that, uh, the only criteria for homework number 1 is this list right here. All right, so let's go over that one by one in a bit. So first, for homework number 1, what you'll have to do is, of course, create a new repository, which will be having this name, Go IT Markup Homework 01, and make an HTML markup for the homework 1 page layout without CSS styling. So for homework number 1, you are not expected to pass your assignment with all of these styles. And even for the fonts, you don't have to implement the fonts for homework number 1, as well as the colors. It doesn't need. You don't need to implement that in homework number 1, since this will only be talking about the markup. So the markup is the focus of the first homework. All right. And then once you have your repository set up and created the markup for the homework number 1, you should be able to set up a GitHub page that will show the output of your homework number 1. All right, so let's go over the criteria for homework acceptance by the tutor. By the way, we have a sample here. So here is a sample. I believe this comes from a previous student from a previous course or sessions. So as you can see, for the homework number 1, you don't see any styling here just yet. So you can only see here the bare bones markup of the page. All right. So the criteria for the first homework will focus on the markup only. So let's go over each of the criteria. So it says here that the main HTML file is called index.html, which I believe I suppose this file here is the index.html. In the root of the project, there is a folder called images. So let's see if we can see the repository of this one. Let's see if we can browse on the homework number 1 for this student. So it says here there should be a folder called images, which we can see that there is, which contains images. So if we look at the images folder, so we can see that there's a number of images inside that folder. All right. So the third criteria, A3, there are no capital letters, spaces, and transliterations in the file names, only English letters and words. And as we can see on the file names, there are no capital letters here aside from the README file, because specifically for the README file, this is the convention for the file name of README. Okay. Actually, README file, it's not entirely required for this homework. It's just that when you create your new repository, it helps a lot. It's easier to set up a new repository when you include a README file. And this is automatically created upon creation. So this shouldn't be a big deal. So you can have README, or you can leave it out. It doesn't matter. It's not part of the requirements. All right. But aside from that, all of the other files, even images, as well as HTML files, all of them should be in small letters. Source code is formatted with prettier. So if we look at the index.html, so we can see that this should be formatted using prettier, which I suppose it's not the case here, since I can see that this one, the head tag here, looks like it has 2 spaces before it. So it's indented with using 2 spaces, but on the child tag, the meta tag, it looks like it has 4 spaces. So if it has been formatted with prettier, it should only have 2 spaces here. All images and text content are taken from the layout. So it's also expected that all of the contents of the page, as we can see in the output right here. So all of the text here should be coming from this design. So you don't have to invent your own design, or you don't have to think of other contents. Like if you like to create your own website, for example, and then you create your own contents. So you don't have to do that. All of the contents, the text, as well as the images, you can just take them all from this design. All right. So by now you should already be familiar with how to copy text from the design, as well as exporting images, right? Then another criteria, all raster images are optimized using Squoosh. So I suppose the images that we see here are all optimized. Let's try if we can see so it's only 47 kilobytes, which I think is already optimized. So for this size of this image, 47 kilobytes is already optimized. Okay, and then the code is in line with the guide. All right, so this shouldn't be much of a problem if you already have Prettier in your VS Code. So if Prettier is installed in your VS Code, and you can see that it's working, like if you hit save and it automatically formats your codes. So it should already be um, compliant with this code guide. So they shouldn't be much of a problem. So the markup, what are the requirements for the markup? So the studio page layout is in the index.html file. All right, we saw that already. HTML markup is done for all layout elements. Okay, and tags are used according to their semantics. If we look at the file that we have here, we can see that this homework is using semantic tags, as we can see in here. So she used header for the main header, which is right here. So this section, and then she wrapped the navigation items inside the nav, as we can see in here. And she also wrapped in multiple links inside an unordered list tag right here. So again, we can see that the indentions are not matching here. So that's also one of the ways that we can see that this is not yet formatted using Prettier. Should this have been formatted using Prettier, the opening and closing tags should be aligned with each other. But in this case, it's not. All right. Then she used main for the main content, which is also semantic. And we can see that for each section, it uses the section element, providing a class. All right. So there's also a problem here because I can see that she implemented a generic class name here, class section. So so it doesn't necessarily bad, but I believe it helps a lot if you give a different class name for each section. All right. So HTML can be validated using validator without errors. So can we check if this is valid HTML? So while we wait for that, so there are tags in the markup for the page structuring. So we've already seen this. Does she have the footer on the bottom, right? There is a footer. So so the W3 org website is down. So let's try if there are other formatters, validators. So let's try if it can be validated here. So we can see that it found two issues. So when you are working with your first homework, you should be able to validate your HTML without errors right here. So bad value, tell illegal character in the schema data. Space is not allowed. So we can see that this one, the telephone link here, for the href value, spaces are not allowed. So if you also experience that, you should update your code and remove all of these spaces just inside the href. All right, for the href value only. For the text content, it's fine. Spaces are allowed. It's just only for the href value. The logo in the header and footer is a link with text, not an image. So this Web Studio should be a text as well as this logo right here. Although you can see that it looks like, oh, it's actually a text in here. So it's using the railway font. That's why it has a different appearance for the W. So it should only be a text, doesn't necessarily need to be an image. The nav tag is used only once in the page header. So there should no other nav tag in the page, and contacts in the header, mail and phone, are outside the nav. So we can see that the phone and the email, so the email and the phone are outside the nav tag. The H1 tag is used once per page. So there should only be one H1 tag in your markup, which is the main header. Effective solutions for your business. So for B10, an element with a text order or service is a button with type button. So if we look at request our service, so we can see that it is a button with a type button. Section headings are marked with H2. And we can see here that section headers, like this one, what we do. So this is a section header, as well as this one. So we can see that we should be able to discern if a header, the purpose of header is for the whole section. If we look at the design, since normally the headings tries to describe the content of that whole section. Like for this one, what we do is the section, the section header for this particular section. Then for B12, all image tags have size attributes, at least width. So if you have an image, there should be a width value attribute in there. Let me just look at the chat. All right, so yep, formatting user Prettier should be automatic once you install Prettier in your VS Code. All right. So if you look at the extensions, try to search for Prettier. It should already be installed. So Prettier code formatter, and there's also, again, there's another extension that allows for the automatic format of your code. It's called toggle formatting toggle. So formatting toggle. So this is the other plugin that is required in order for the Prettier extension to automatically format your code. All right. And then, so all image tags have alt attribute, which contains a brief description of what is shown in the picture. So yeah, as we can see in here, there's an alt attribute for each of the images. And then images are exported from the layout in JPG format or JPEG format. So all of the images should be in JPEG, not PNG, not SVG, only JPEG. And groups of the same type elements are in the UL list. So what are the samples of that? So we can see here that we have these items in here. So they look very similar, and by the looks of it, they they are supposed to be rendered as a list. All right, so we will be using UL for that, since they are not numbered and the order doesn't, like, the order is not necessary at this point. So we can just use UL for this list. All right. The address tag is only used in the footer. So we can see at the bottom that we have the address information in here. So we have the actual physical address as well as the email address and telephone number. So it should only be used once in the footer, and there should be no other instances of the address tag anywhere in the page. All right. So again, just to clarify, for homework number 1, this is the expected output of your um, homework. So it doesn't need to have any design, just the markup. So for homework number 2, although we will not be going over each of the criteria for this second homework, we can just look at the sample homework that is submitted in here. So you can see that it's almost just the same with the first one. So the layout is still not, doesn't look like this, but we can see that it already implemented some basic styling, such as font size, font colors, background colors, as well as the fonts, the font files. Fonts are also installed here. So we can see, looking at the network tab of the developer tools, it's coming from Google fonts. All right. So all of these fonts are imported using Google fonts. We can also see that in the head tag, we can see the link tag here that uses href that has a value of the, oh, no, this is a normalized, so this is not it. So I think it's inside the style.css. Yep. So for this one, we can see that she tried to import or install the font using @import, but we didn't cover this on the previous lesson, since we only installed the font using the link tag. All right, and then using the href of the CSS file provided by the Google Fonts. So you can also do this, but there's some like optimizations, and it's much efficient if we use link tag. If it's coming from a third-party provider like Google Fonts, it's much better if we import um, fonts using the link tag that they provide. So there's a reason for that, but we will not be talking about that on this lesson. So yeah, for homework number 2, you can see that it only implemented basic styles, colors, fonts, text formats, background colors, just that. And we can see that it actually have some additional uh, styles here that are not covered in this second homework. So you can see that the bullet points are already gone here. So that's not yet covered in this module. So this is a little advanced, but you don't have to do that. If there are bullet points that are still visible in your homework, it's fine, since it's not yet covered in this lesson. All right. So yeah, so you can see that, by the way, this output, this homework will also be, should be on a new repository. So we can see on the criteria that it tells us to create a new repository, which is named Go IT Markup Homework 02. So what you can do, if you still haven't started working on second homework just yet, if you already have homework number 1, what you can do is create a new repository in your GitHub. So let me just show that just quick. So let me add a new repository named homework 2. Then I want to add a README file. Now, once I create this and clone this on my local, so open with GitHub desktop. So if I clone this, what I can do is I can just go over my homework number 1. Say, for example, this is our homework number 1. So I can just copy the necessary files from homework number 1. So let's say the index.html as well as the images folder. So homework number 1 also requires you to have the images folder, right? So you should copy that, and then you can just paste that inside homework number 2. All right. So homework, the work that you have done for homework number 1 should be carried over to the second homework. All right. So you don't have to do everything from scratch again. Just copy over the first homework and just create a new repository for that. All right. So now it's now 8 p.m. All right. So we should now be starting with our new lesson. For the homework number 3, so we can just talk about this on the next on the next session. Okay, since homework number 3 will be covering module number 3, which we will be starting tonight. So let's just leave it for now. And let's now continue or proceed with our lesson. So it is said on the codeguide.com, avoid using at import. So that's another tip for you guys. Don't use at import. So even if you can do that, technically for your homeworks and based on the codeguide.com, don't use that because it's not optimal. There are problems using that. So just use the link. All right. All right. So yep. So let's now proceed with our lesson. So for the lesson for tonight, we'll be talking about the box model. So how does the box of an element actually works? We will also be talking about element geometry and how we can customize the geometry of an element. We'll also talk about different display types of elements and also structural pseudo classes. So let's look at the box model. So this box model that we see right here. So this looks familiar. This might be familiar with you guys since if you remember when I inspect my HTML here, we can see that in the computed tab of the styles right here. So this also shows the box model of an element. So say for example, let's inspect this anchor tag. So we can see that this is the box model of this element. So the box model, the composition of the box model is as follows. So the innermost part of the box is called the content. So basically, content is either the text of the element or the children of an element. So if we look at this element, for example, let's look at the header. So the content of the header are these children elements. So this nav and UL, they're all part of the header content. And for this paragraph, uh, we can't see that because of the color of the text. So let's instead look at the services and prices link. So we can see that the tag, the anchor tag, have a text content inside it. So this is the content of this anchor tag. So outside the content is the padding. So the padding, you can think of it as the inner spacing of an element. So to make it easier for us to visualize, let me create a new file instead, named box model. And then let me just give it a title and the main content. And sorry about that. It should be on the root folder. So there you go. And for this one, let's just use a different file or CSS file, box model.css. Again, to include that CSS file, you should already know by now how to do it. So it's a link tag with a real attribute of a style sheet value. And let's just use a relative path targeting the box model CSS. All right. So let's just create a section with a class name of box with some basic text content. So what does it look like? Are we serving our files at this point? So not yet. So let's go live. I should be able to start up a server for us. And we should be able to see that in the browser, just like so. So you can see that we have a content text here. And inspecting on that element, so we can see that it is a section with a class box with a basic text content. All right, so let's give it a basic styling for now. Let's give it a background color of yellow so we can see the content. And so class is box. All right. All right, so the automatic reload doesn't work. But anyway, so we can see that the box section has now yellow background. All right, so if we add a padding of 50 pixel, we can see that this box section now has extra space inside it. So from the bounding box or the boundaries of the element, and in between that boundary and the content of the element, we can see the spacing inside it. So that is the padding. All right, so it's the spacing inside the box of the element. And then next to padding is the border. So I believe you already familiar with the border, so we can just give it a basic border. So by the way, I'll explain a little later the format for the border. So let me just do it quickly for now. So we can see that after the padding, we have the border. And outside the border, we have the margin. So if the padding is the spacing inside the element, the margin is the spacing outside the element. So we can see that the element now have a space outside it. So we now have now has a spacing of or margin of 50 pixels. All right. So and then we can also see that there are top, right, bottom, left. So there are also extra um, properties in which we can control the offset of the element on the top, right, bottom, and left. But we will not yet covering that on this lesson. All right, so we're only talk about up to the margin. All right, so that is the basics of the box element or the box model of an element. So now we've seen that all of the styling that we have provided for the box, all of them works, right? But let's try to, I want to show you something. So let's create a span here. All right. So let's give it a class name of box content. All right. So we have removed all of the other styling. Just leaving out the yellow background color. And then let's say, let's add a padding into box content. So let's try to give it a background color first. Let's give it a green background. And let's add a padding of 20 pixels. So let's see what will happen. Oops. All right, so you might have noticed that there is something different here. So when we added a padding on the box, we can see that the spacing inside of the box, we now have a spacing inside the box, and also the content adjusted accordingly, right? But the boundaries of the actual element is not affected, right? It stays the same. It's just that it added padding inside it, and then the content adjusted accordingly. But in the case of the span, even though we have added the padding, we will see that it doesn't push, or the boundaries of the span element also adjusted outward, right? So what we expect is that when we add padding here, so the element now have um, is now wider and is now a little taller than before. We might expect that the yellow section should also adjust to that height, but it wasn't the case here. Why? Because we have different display types or box model types. So for box model types, we can control that using box sizing. So what do we mean by box sizing? So let me just show an illustration first, and let's use content box. So now, if we try to add a box sizing of content box, what will happen? So it still doesn't work, but if we add a display block to the span, so now the padding now works. So the section adjusted accordingly. So we can see that by giving this a width of 50 pixels or 150. So now the section adjusts accordingly. All right. So what do we mean by box sizing? So when we say box sizing, we have the content box and the border box. So let's look at the border box first. So what we mean by border box is that when we set the width and the height of an element, it applies up to the border of the element. say for example box, we have a box here. So let's give it a width of say for 500 pixels. Also a height of say 200 pixels. So we can see that the box, the yellow box, now have a width of 500 pixels and a height of 200 pixels. So how do I confirm that? So I have here a Chrome extension installed. So it's called dimensions. So it's called dimensions. So it allows me to measure an element in the page, but it doesn't seem to work right now. So if I click that, I suppose this is also caused by Zoom. Yeah, this must have been caused by Zoom. So it's enabled, but it's not working. But there's also another way to confirm that. If we look at the computed styles in the developer tools, we can see that the width is 500 pixels. All right. So what if we give it a box sizing of content box? And then let's try to add a padding of 50 pixels. So you might have noticed that the element became larger. So let's try that again. So let's remove the box sizing content box. So by the way, the section element by default, the box sizing, and even all of the block level elements by default, their box sizing is border box. So if we have border box and we have a padding here, so what happens is that the width is still 500 pixels. So the padding, what it did is it pushed the contents inward. All right. So when using, sorry, let me rephrase that again. For the border box, the width and the height, it only affects the content of that element. So let's try to make this a div instead, so we can see what I mean. So border box, the height and width, it applies to the element itself, and then the padding, it only pushes the contents inwards. As we can see in here, the section still have 500 by 200. So we can see that by the tooltip when we hover on the element, it says 500 by 200. And then the padding only pushes the contents inward. But if you use a content box, the width and the height is only implemented or applied to the content inside it. So the main element will grow larger, and we can see that the content now has a 500 pixel width. Okay, and the box now have 600 pixel width by 300. So that is how border box and content box works. All right, so we can set that box sizing globally by using something like this. Since normally all of the elements in the page, we want to apply the width and the height on the element itself. All right. So in practice, we can apply a box sizing of border box to all of the elements, and it's fine. All right. So why do we need to do that? So you might have noticed earlier that when we use span, so span is an inline element, which I will explain more a little later. By default, the box sizing of the span element is content box. That's why when we try to add a padding inside it, so the the padding caused the span to grow larger. So it didn't push the content inwards, but rather it made the element larger because it is a content box. So that's the default box sizing for inline elements. So that includes anchor tags as well as EM and all of the other inline elements. So this one right here, so you can see that there is an asterisk. So what this means is this is a selector for all elements. So if you use this, you are trying to style all of the elements. So normally you don't use this on any other purpose, uh, but rather only for global stylings relating to layout like this one, border box. So we also have the before and after pseudo elements, but uh, there's um, there's a specific lesson that we'll cover here, so I won't be explaining this for now. So let's focus on the just the all selector. Right? So now all of the elements should now have a border box sizing. So what this this approach right here, uh, this falls under the concept of normalization. So by normalization, what we mean by that is we are trying to implement global styles in order to normalize it for all of the browsers. Since if we don't do that, each browser has its own set of defaults. Like for paragraph tags, for example, um, it each browser have their default margins for paragraphs. So what will happen is that your website will look different on different websites if you don't implement a normalizing style. So normalizer is just a plain CSS which we can include. You can either do your own, so something like this, or you can just use an existing one like this. For example, we are using one from Modern Normalize, and if we look at this, it's just a CSS file with um, global styles. So we can see the non-compressed style like this. So as you can see here, it implemented the star selector both for all elements as well as for the before and after pseudo elements, and implemented a box sizing of border box and some other normalizations. All right. So you can just include a normalizer in your homework. It's fine. So you can just use this. So by the way, let me just leave that in the teacher channel for your reference, right? So next, let's take a look at element geometry. So we'll be looking at different properties that allows us to control the element geometry. So we have already seen how the padding works, but there are other ways in which we can set the padding around an element. So for this example, let's take this existing markup, and let's just focus on the box section for now. So let's remove this padding. So if we use a single unit or a single value for the padding, it will try to add the padding on all of the sides of the element. So as you can see in here, if I hover on that element, we can see that it has padding all around it. All right, so if we look at the computed value, oops, sorry about that. Let me just remove these other properties. So padding of 20 pixels is implemented on all sides of this section. So we can confirm that in the computed value, the padding on the top, right, bottom, and left are all 20. So if we try to supply two values for the padding, so as you can see, we have here 10 pixels and 20 pixels. So what will it do is that it will try to add 10 pixel paddings for the vertical paddings. So that means top and bottom, and then 20 pixels on the horizontal paddings. So that's left and right. So let's see that in our sample. So now, if we look at the box model, we can see that on the top and bottom, it now have 10 pixels paddings, and on the sides, it now have 20 pixel paddings on each side. All right. So we can also give three values, and what this will do is it will apply 10 pixels on the top, 20 pixels on the sides, so that's left and right, and 5 pixels on the bottom. So this second value here, this corresponds to the left and right padding. And we can see right here, 10 pixels on the top, 5 pixels on the bottom, and on the sides we have 20 pixels. All right. And then last, we can implement, or we can supply individual values for each side using this shorthand syntax. So we have 10 pixels for the top, 15 pixels on the right, 20 pixels on the bottom, and 25 pixels on the left. So take note of that. On this notation for the padding, it starts from the top and then going on clockwise. So if we save that, so the 10 pixels on the top, followed by the 15 pixels on the right padding, and then the bottom is 20, and the left padding is 25. So starting from the top, goes around clockwise. All right. So if you supply all of the four individual paddings. Also, there's also a way to give individual values or individual paddings for each side. So you can use padding top, padding right, padding bottom, and padding left. So you can take this approach, or you can also take this approach. It will work the same. All right. So this approach is looks cleaner than this one. right? If you are just aiming for the same output. So we can just use the shorthand notation. All right, so aside from padding, we also have the margin. So as what we've learned, padding is the spacing inside the element, while the margin is the spacing outside the element. So if we try to do a margin here, so it will add spaces outside the element. All right. So let me just leave the padding of 20 pixel here just to see the difference. So the padding is inside and then the margin is outside the element. So the same with padding, you can also do the same syntax. So you can apply um, a single value for all of the sides using single pixel value here, or you can also do two values. So one for the vertical margins, the top and the bottom, and then one for the left and right, which we can see in here. So the margins on top and bottom are 20, and we have 50 pixels on the sides. Right, and then we can also do three values. By the way, let me just mute one of you. Yep. All right. So moving on. So let's give this 15 pixel bottom margin. So we are now doing a three value syntax, which we can see. So the 20 pixel value on the top, and then the second value is for the sides. So 50 pixels on the left and right. And the last value is 15 pixels for the bottom. And the same thing with the four values like so. So we now have individual values for each side. And also, the same with padding, you can also implement individual margins on each side. So we can do margin top, we can do margin bottom, left and right. So it's just the same with padding. But unlike the padding, there is a special behavior for margins. So let's say we have two box sections here. So now they go on top of each other. So let's try to add a margin. So let me just add a vertical margin of 50 pixels and a left and right padding of 20 pixels. And let's see how that works. So you can see that if you take notice, the margin above this first box is of course 50 pixels. My dimensions not working, so yeah. So let's just look at the spacing. So that is 50 pixels above. Now, for the content number 2 or the second box below it, we know that the bottom, the top and bottom margins are both 50 pixels, right? So what we will expect is that in between them, there should be a 100 pixel margin, right? But you see that they are just the same. So the 50 pixels above is the same with 50 pixels in between them. So why is that? We call that the margin collapse, the vertical margin collapse. So vertical margin collapse, what it does is uh, it seems to merge both the margins of the adjacent elements. So we have the element here, and then next to it is another element. So uh, it collapses the margin. So it means that the browser takes the margin in between them, and then it takes the larger one. So the whichever is larger, that will be the final margin or spacing that will be implemented in between them. So we can confirm that if we use different margins for the top and the bottom. So for this one, so we have 50 pixels margin on the top and 100 pixels margin on the bottom. So if we refresh that, so what happens is the spacing in between the first box and the second box is now just 100 pixels. So we can see that we can see the orange spacing. So that's the 100 pixel margin bottom for the first box. And for the second box, we can see that the orange highlight, so that represents the top margin, which is 50 pixels. So it from the two margins, the browser only takes the larger one to be the final space or the final margin in between them. So that is how margin collapse works. So in padding, there is no padding collapse, just the margin collapse. All right. So take note of that. All right. So let us now go to element geometry about the borders. So now that we talked about the paddings and margins, let's now go to the border. So you have seen this a couple of times already. So let me just add a padding of 10 pixels. So the basic format for the border, it has three parts. So first is the size or the width of the border. So usually it's just 1 pixel. And then the type. So the most common one is the solid. We can also do dashed, right? So the most common is solid. And the last part is the color. So we can just do red right here. And we can see that both of the boxes now have borders around it. Okay. So we can also set the individual properties of border separately, like in this one. So instead of this, we can do this. We can set the border width, 1 pixel, the border style, solid, border color of red, and it will work just the same. All right. So, and the same with paddings and margins. You can also set individual uh, properties for the borders on each side. So you can do border top and give it a shorthand syntax. And you will see that it It's only applied on the top border. If we do a border bottom, let's give it a dash and a color of green. You can see that now, let me just zoom it a little bit. We now have a dashed border on the bottom of the box, and it has green color. Okay. But actually, we can also set a larger border. So now we have a thicker border at the bottom. All right. So you can also do individual border property for individual side. So what do we mean by that? So I can do border top width 1 pixel, border top style solid, border top color of red, which is just the same as this one. No, not that one, but this one, border top with the shorthand syntax. So it's the same with this one. All right. So those are the many ways in which you can style borders. But the most common is just this one. All right. Since normally if you add a border, it's supposed to be applied on all sides of the element. So it's only on rare cases that there are different styles for each sides of the border. And we can also do rounded border using border radius. So the elements by default, they have a box model, which is a rectangular in shape. And we can add rounded borders for that by using border radius. And the value is we can do pixel. So for this example, let's give it a 20 pixel border. And let's just leave the red border so we can see it. So now you can see that it now has rounded corners. So if we do a larger value, so the rounded corners will also be larger. So the most common use of this are for the buttons, like what we see in here in our sample project, book a service button. You can see that it has rounded corners. So we use border radius for that. Okay. Now let's go to the different element uh, display types. Let me just clear out some of my styles. Okay, so the most basic element display types of elements, we have the block and the inline. So on previous lessons, um, I've already given some overview about this, but we will go a little deeper about this topic on this lesson. So display block and display inline. So display block, the behavior of a block element is that the elements stack on each other. So regardless of their width, each element will occupy the whole line. So as we can see in here, so the sections, the box sections that we have here, they are they are block elements. So that is why they are taking the space of the whole line by default. So if we remove the width, it will occupy the whole span or the whole width of the page. Okay. As for inline elements, so it only occupies the space according to its content. So we have the span here. So let's give it some background so we can see. All right, so let me just, okay. All right. So for the box content, let's give it a background color of green. Oh, there you go. Do we have a lime? Yeah, we have a lime. Yep. So we can see the text much better. So for inline elements, it only occupies the same line. As long as there is available space for its content, as we can see in here. So the three spans only goes on the same line. As long as there is an available space, it will only take that space. So let's try to give it a width of 500 pixels, and let's add a span that have longer words. So now let's give it a class of box content. So you can see that this single span here, now it takes multiple lines, right? Because the content of it's not it doesn't fit just on the same line, so it needs to go on the next lines below it in order to uh, account for its content. So that is how inline element works. So there are some basic differences between the block and inline elements aside from how they flow in the page. There are also some other differences between them. So for the block elements, we can set the width and the height. So say for example, we leave this span that have multiple lines. So if we set the block elements, in this case, our block element is the yellow box. So we can see that when we gave it a 500 pixel width, so it is applied on the box. But let's try to give a width, to give the span a width. So let's give it, say, a smaller width. So let's see what will happen. So you see that it didn't take effect. So we can see as we inspect, the width is still there. So the styles or the CSS is still there. It's not missing, but it's not applied because it is or it's an inline element. So for the block elements, we can set the width and height, but not for the inline elements. And also for the block elements, as we can see here, we can set the margins and paddings, and it will affect the layout of the page. All right. So as we can see here in the box content, we have or the box, the yellow box, we have margins around it, and we can see that the margin is pushing the yellow box accordingly. But if we look at the inline, so this lorem ipsum here, So let's try to give it a margin of 50 pixels. So let's see what will happen here. So you'll notice that for inline elements, only the side padding works. And because inline elements are also content box by default, so the margins are just pushing outside the element. So it's not pushing the element itself, but rather the elements are pushing outward, or the margin pushes outward. And for the margin sides, or for each side of the margin, the only effective margins for inline elements are the side margins. So the top and bottom margins are not taking effect for inline elements. All right. So now, to put it simply, it's easier to lay out block elements in this case, as we can see here, right? So since we can set the block or the width and height for the block element, as well as the margin and paddings, it will work as expected, but not with the inline elements. But say, for example, uh, we have, this is usually the case with buttons. Let's say we have different buttons. So button 1, and button 2. So usually buttons, they go on the same line, right? So, but the buttons, they have they fall under a hybrid type of display. So it's not block, it's not inline block. I mean, it's not inline, but rather an inline block type of display. So inline block is like a combination of block and inline. So what it allows us to do is the elements can still go on the same line. All right. But you can also set the width and height, as well as the paddings and margins, and they will take effect. They will affect the layout around that element. So buttons by default are inline block elements. So we can see here that they are occupying the same line, but we can give them, or we can set their dimensions. We can give it, say, 150 pixels and a height of, say, 30 pixels. And let's also set the margins around them. Let's just give it 20 pixels margin. And we can see that now this button right here, it now goes on the next line. So the same behavior with the inline elements. But we can also set the width, the height, as well as the margins, and it will take effect. As we can see in here, the dimensions of the button is 150 by 30 pixels in height. So that's the inline block elements. So what are the usual use case for inline block elements? So in our example, this navigation links right here, so we can apply inline blocks to them. All right, and let's just do that. So let me zoom this out a bit. And then let's go back to our index.css, and let's go to our main header menu link. So as we can see here, the list items, or the LI, So they are block elements by default, as we can see in here. So they are the ones that we want to go and occupy the same line. So let's select that. So let's just add a selector here, and let's give it a display inline block. We can see that they now go on the same line, right? And also there is also uh, one style that I want to show you. So let's just remove the black color from the background, and let's just use a black color for the navigation items. So there you go. So now they go on the same line. And now if we give it margin, all right, so in this case, the margins are only applied in between each navigation link, right? So we only want side margins in between them. So we can see that, so using the dev mode, if we hover on the next element in the design, we can see the spacing. So that is 40 pixel. So what we can do is just apply a 40 pixel on the right margin of each element. All right, so we can do just that. So again, if we are only applying a margin on a single side, we can just use the specific side for it. So in this case, margin right, we can add 40 pixels for that. We can see that it's now applied. So we now have 40 pixels spacing in between them. So the other thing that we want to take or to occupy the same line as this navigation links are these other header elements like this one, the logo, as well as this other links and button here. So what we can do is also apply an inline block display for this element, since this is the block level element, right? So what is this element? So that's the main header menu. So let's just do just that. So main header menu, we can apply a display of inline block, just like so. So we have an extra text here. I think it's just only some text, but let's address that later on. So we also need to put inline block display to these items. So first, let's add a class name for each of them. So yeah, let's just give this a class of main header. Let's say CTAs or call to actions. And then for the LIs, well, let me just input at them at the same time. Main header CTAs item. So now let's take this main header CTAs item. So let me just put it here. And let's give it a display of inline block. So now the telephone number and the button goes on the same line, but not the main container for that two elements, which is the main header CTAs. And we also need to apply an inline block display. Main header CTAs. So that should be correct. All right, so yep, main header CTAs is now an inline block, but we also need to do an inline block display on the main header nav. So we can put it here. Display inline block. So you might have noticed that I'm using inline block instead of inline, since we want to have full control on the dimensions of each element. So inline, it will, of course, it will show us the same behavior. They will all go to the same line, but we don't have that liberty in terms of like controlling the width, the height, and the spacing in between each element. So we want to use inline block for that. All right. So now that we have implemented inline block, let's try to look at our next topic. So by the way, we also have a display hidden. So what this basically does, it's just hiding the element. So for the main header now, let's try to give it a display hidden. And we can see that main header nav should be hidden, or sorry about that. So it's not hidden, but display none. So display none hides the element, right? So now we have talked about 4 different displays: the display block, the display inline, and then the display inline block, and the display none. All right, so let me just put that back in. So now we are almost getting into this layout. We now have um, our main header items going on the same line. So let's now talk about container elements. So you might notice, so let's just look at the homework example instead. So for this one, sorry about that. If you try to pull up the layout grids, so you can show that by going on the zoom and view options and checking the layout grids. So let me just select that, and so it should be visible at this point, but for some reason it's not showing. Oh, yep. So there you go. So now you can see that there is a layout grid. So what does this mean? So actually, let me just go to the second page. So this one, so this one is more updated. So let me try to show that again, the layout grids. So again, it's not showing up for some reason. Might be on the other. So it's hidden. Yep. So now we have the layout grids. So you can just follow the same approach that I did. If ever you have toggled the layout grids on, but you can see it, you will see the options under the layout grid in the sidebar. So you can just toggle the eye icon here to show it up. So what this tries to show us is there is a certain limit as to how the page content will extend horizontally. So we can think of this as the container element. So we can see that for each section, they are sharing the same container width. So how do we implement something like that? So let's try, for example, this. Let's take this example instead, since the barbershop example is it has a little complicated layout. So let's just take this more simpler layout. So we can see that the contents for this section, it only goes before that purple spacing on the sides. So this purple or blue, if you may, this is the padding of the container. So the actual container, it goes from this side up to this side. All right. So we have the container spanning from this side up to this side, and then we have paddings on the sides. And the padding size, so let's go to dev mode and let's try to add. So we can do that by clicking on the rectangle icon to add another element, and we can just draw a new rectangle here to match the width. So we can see that the width is 15 pixels. So the section padding is 15 pixels on the side. So now let's try to implement that. So in order for us to see or to apply a section container, we can add additional wrapper inside each section. So for example, we take this hero section. So where is our hero? Yep. So this is our hero section. And all of this content, we can add another wrapper. So in this case, we can use div for this one. Since a wrapper doesn't need to be a semantic element, it's just a wrapper for cosmetic purpose. So we can just do a generic div, and then let's just add a class name. So let's just do section container. And then we can reuse the same class name for all the other sections. But for now, let's just implement it first on the first section. So now it doesn't work just yet since we don't implement style just yet. So let's do that in our CSS. So let's select the container, section container. And then let's try to add a width. So what is the width of our section? So if we try to hover on this group of images, we can see that it has a border around it. So it means that uh, this is a group. This is an element group. And then we can just select it. And then we can see that it has a width of 1160 pixels. So let's try to do that on the next section if it's the same. So we can see that instead on this one, it has a different width. So what for the section wrapper, what we want to get is the width of the actual wrapper from side to side. So we can do that by adding another rectangle, then trying to draw a rectangle over it. So spanning from this side up to that side, we can see that the width of the section is 1200 pixels or 1200 pixels, which which appears to be making much more sense rather than this one. So it's 1200 pixels. So let's do just that. Let's give it a 1200 pixels. And then based on what we have derived earlier, we now know that the padding is 15 pixels. But that's just the side paddings. We don't want to add top and bottom paddings for the wrapper. Okay, so for this one, so what syntax can we use for this one? So what kind of notation? So we have different notations, right? But what specific notation can we use for this? So we can use the two value notation. So the first one is the top and bottom, which we can just use a 0 pixel. And then the side paddings of 15 pixels. So let me just confirm that once again. Let me draw a rectangle here to match that. So zoom in a little bit, adjust it to match. So now it's 15 pixels. Yep, confirming that it is 15 pixels. So we can't see that just yet. So let's try to add a background so we can see how it looks. So now we can see, so I just zoomed out my uh, my viewport into 100% normal zoom. So now the section spans at 1230. But what we want is to have only a 1200 width for the section and make the paddings go inside. So let's just add a normalizer here, which applies a border box or a box sizing of border box. So as we will learn before, border box, what this will do is that when you apply a width or a height to an element, so it will apply it, it will affect up to the border of the element. So any padding and borders will just be pushed inward. So let's try to see if that works. So now if we hover on the element, so it now have 1200 pixels width and the padding goes inward. Okay, so now we have one other problem, which is the alignment. So excuse me a bit. We can see that the container now have the desired width, but it is aligned on the left. So we want that to be aligned on the center. So how do we do that? So we can use a padding for that. So for the left, we can use the value auto. And then we can use the same value for the right. And now we have a centered container. So now if we try to implement the same wrapper on the other sections, are we getting the same result? So let's see. So for the about section, let's add a div with a class name of section container. And let's move all of the contents inside it. And now you can see that the contents of the about section is now centered as well. So it's now wrapped inside our wrapper. So let's do that again for the other section, services. So let's take all of these contents and place it inside the section container. And we now have our sections aligned in the center. All right, so now that we can confirm that our section works, we can now delete or remove the yellow background. Okay, so now one thing that we can notice here is for this section, we actually have some spacing on the top and the bottom, right? So for this case, normally what we use here is instead of padding or sorry, instead of margin, we are using padding for this. So we will only apply padding on the top and on the bottom. So we can see that using the dev mode, if we try to click on the topmost element, so we can select just one from here, and then hover on the section above it, we get the 94 pixels. And on the bottom, we also get the 94 pixels spacing. So we can just add a top and bottom padding for this specific element. So with regards to top and bottom padding for each section, it's highly recommended that you implement it individually for each section. Like for this section, what we do, you'll want to implement 94 pixels for this specific section, because most of the time, each section have their different vertical paddings. So in this case, they have the same, but it's still recommended that you implement them separately. So the padding, we will not put it in the section container, but rather on the section itself. So say for example, the about section, about, let's use a padding. So vertically, we have 94 pixel paddings, and we can just give it a 0 padding on the sides. And we can see that now this section now has vertical paddings. All right. So now for uh, the next section, we can see that it also has a 94 pixel padding. So let's try to implement that as well for services. So let me just take the shortcut. Let me just copy this and paste in a quick way. And let's give it a class name of services. So now our services section now has its top and bottom padding, just like so. Now, if we look at the theme section, like what we have here, so we can actually implement that on this. So we can see that it has a background, and in this case, on the R theme, it also have a background. So let's just hide the layout grids this time. Let me select the main and hide the layout grids. So now we can see that it indeed have a yellow a background color. So how do we get the background color? So we can switch back to the dev mode, and we can see that. So now, if we click on it the first time, you might notice that uh, doesn't give us the background color right away. But We can try that again one time, and we now see that the style here shows the background color. So we can just take that, and instead of putting that directly, we can just put it in a CSS variable. We can give it a name of color light gray. And we can take that variable and use that for our services. Background color, and let's use the variable color light gray. And now we have a section that have a light gray background color. All right. So now let's go back to the navigation again. So we will see, let's see if it's also the case here. So if we take back the outlines or the layout grids, we can see that it also takes the same section width for the main header. So for that, for this case, we can also reuse that section container. It will work just fine. Yep. So it's now taking the same width for for the for the main header. However, since this class name, if we look at the semantics of this, this is supposed to be used only for the contents. So for each section. So what we can do is instead of using the section container class name, we can just do main header container instead, and then just use the same style for section container. So it's just the same. So main header container. It may just look the same and the styles are just identical, but I want you to take note of the semantics of your codes. I believe if you use section container here, it will just be fine. But me personally, I'm not very comfortable with that in terms of the semantics. I'd like to make the class name as semantic as possible. So I want to use a different class name for this. So it may look the same in terms of the layout and styling, but in terms of semantics, it makes more sense to use a different class name. So it's more about preference. So I'm not forcing you to do that, but I encourage you to do the same approach. So now you might notice that when we gave a section container or a width on the main navigation, now these two items are now pushed on the next line because uh, there's not enough space for these two items on the right side. So what we can do is, I believe we are not having the correct font size. Yep. So let's just do that. So let's try to place that on the menu link, menu tell. Font size 12 pixels. So now they are looking much better now. And for our logo, the width is 68.93. But personally, I round that on the nearest rounded number. So, but it's already 69 pixels. So I think that's good enough. So one of the reasons here is that the last item, so remember we have used margin right to, to add spacing in between them, between each of the navigation links. So the last item also have the margin. So what we want is to remove the margin right on the last. So now, so margin right 0. So it's not taking effect. So let's just use important for this for now. Let's see if it takes effect. So for some reason, it's not taking effect. Or it does. Yep, it does work. So if we look at some of the extra spacing that's not supposed to be there, we can see that in the main header menu, there's an extra padding on the left. So that is a default padding for UL. So we can remove that by going on the main header menu and removing the padding left. So you might notice that we used padding left here. We didn't use the shorthand syntax because it's specific only for the left padding. Now it's gone. So it might also be the case with this one since it's also using the UL tag. So we can remove that as well from the main header CTAs. Padding left, give it a 0. Now it's gone. So now we still have a problem here. So the right margin is still there. So how do we address that? So we only want to target this last item to remove the margin. So there is a way to do that. So in CSS, we have the structural pseudo classes. So we have the first child and last child. So these classes are being used to access child elements. So let's look at the first child first. So we can use this on any child element. So in this case, it's main header menu item. And let's take the main header. Sorry, that should be main header menu item. First child. And let's give it, so it should be double colon. No, doesn't need. So it's only a single colon. Let's give it a background color of yellow just to see what will happen. So now the first item is now has a background color of yellow. So what we want is to access this last item and remove the right margin. So we can do that by using the last child. So instead of the first child, let's address the last child and give it a margin right of 0. So now if we look at the last item, the margin right should now be gone. Yep, it's now gone. So only the first few items have it, but not the last one. All right. Okay, so this item or the main header menu, and then we have main header CTAs is still. Oh, yep. Sorry, that's my bad. The main header CTAs has been left outside. That's why it's not going on the same line. So it should also be inside the main header container. And we can see that now it's on the same line with the others. Now we can see that it has a spacing here. So you should already know by now how to implement that. But the problem is we can see that these two guys in here are flushed on the far most right of the main header. So how do we do that? So let's try to apply a margin here, margin CTAs, main header CTAs. Let's try to add a margin left auto. So it doesn't work. Yep. So now there is a way to do that, but it will be covered on the next lesson. So I'll hang you for now with that. So there are other structural pseudo classes, but these are not frequently used. So we can look at the nth child. So what does the nth child do? So if we look at main header menu item nth child, you can supply the actual number of item here. So if you are trying to access just the second item here, so the second child, you can just put 2. Give it a background color of yellow, and we can see that it's indeed affected. All right. So that's the nth child. So we also have even and odd. So even, nth child even. So all of the children whose numbers in the order are even will be affected by this style, as we can see in here. So 2 and 4 are even numbers, so they are selected here. So how about odd? We also have a selector for that. So 1, 3, and 5 are odd numbers, and they are selected this way. All right, so we also have the nth last child and even some custom formula that we can implement using nth child, but we will not be covering that for now because some of these concepts are somewhat advanced in nature, and we don't normally do that uh, uh, norm frequently in the pages. So you can just use last child, first child, and the nth child in implementing your styles. All right. So, yep, I believe that's it for now, for tonight. For the next lesson, we will be talking about Flexbox. All right. So I also like you to do an advanced learning for the Flexbox. And that's the concept that we might be using to implement this layout. There are other ways to implement this, but nowadays in the modern CSS state of CSS, we can use Flexbox to implement this. All right. So I believe we have questions. Yep. So, but unfortunately, we ran out of time. So, yep. So let's just take these questions and let's address that on the next lesson. All right, since we've taken some time for the homework walkthrough. So I hope regarding the homeworks, it's much clearer now. So for each of the homeworks, there are only there's a set of specific criteria that you have to implement. So you don't have to implement the whole design for each of the homework. So there are only certain criteria for each of them. And that's the only stuff that you need to do. All right. Again, for the remaining questions and answers, we will be implementing, or we will be answering them on the next lesson. So hopefully this has been clear with you guys. So if not, just leave your questions and kindly just go back to the recording so that it can be clearer to you. All right. So again, thank you again, everyone. So I hope to see you again on the next lesson, in which we will talk about Flexbox. All right,
All right.
all right.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much, Teacher Jason, for today. And of course, we would like to say thank you for attending our class for today. And can I request for an open camera so that we can take a picture before we close the Zoom link? All right. Thank you so much, everybody. All right. I'll just count in three, two, one. Give me a smile. Thank you. For the next slide. All right, can I have another shot for the second slide? Can you open your cameras, please? All right, thank you so much. In three, two, one, smile. Thank you. For the last slide. Three, two, one, smile. All right. Thank you, everybody, for attending our class today. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to message us anytime. And you can also message Teacher Jason or our mentors to assist you. All right. All right. Thank you, everybody. Again, have a good night. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you po. Bye.